January 29th, 1943. USS Enterprise, cruiser San Diego, and 5 destroyers are headed for an expected showdown with the Imperial fleet near the Coral Sea. By now, the mighty Enterprise has many nicknames. Most call her the Big E, or Lucky E, but many sailors call her the Galloping Ghost, or simply, the Gray Ghost. In a year of combat, from the coast of Oahu to the shores of Guadalcanal, the dark gray ship has eluded death and destruction and continues to haunt the Imperial Navy. But the battle-tested crew of Enterprise has no idea the tragedy is about to strike the U.S. fleet. 350 miles away, a force of cruisers and destroyers heads for Guadalcanal, escorting American transports loaded with much-needed reinforcements. More ground troops are needed on the island battlefield, and it's the job of these ships to get them there. One of them is heavy cruiser USS Chicago. Chicago, sister to the old Northampton, which had fought beside the Enterprise throughout 1942, is led by a squadron of 6 destroyers spread out in a giant half-circle. Steaming at a steady 24 knots, Chicago and the transport force are 150 shark-infested nautical miles directly southeast of Guadalcanal. Chicago has already survived one hellish attack this night by enemy aircraft. But the waters of the Solomon Islands are still a nightmare. Sailors know that being in the wrong place at the wrong time can have deadly consequences. And right now, Chicago is heading toward disaster she can't even see. Beneath the waves, Chicago is stalked by Japanese submarines. From above the clouds, she is hunted by enemy planes. Though the Japanese have been badly bloodied in Pacific Sea battles, they're about to show the U.S. Navy that they're nowhere close to being beaten. Like a jungle predator, the enemy prepares to strike in the dark of night. Because of the costly actions at Midway and Guadalcanal, Japan simply lacks the manpower and firepower to launch daytime attacks against the U.S. fleet.
They've trained a number of their ground-based medium bomber units in night torpedo attacks, and they come gunning for the American cruiser support force.
7:45 p.m. Flashes of light illuminate the American ships like a lightning storm. Japanese flares burst in the skies over the water. Suddenly, 16 twin-engine Bettys pour out of the sky. One Betty is chewed up by automatic fire and sent crashing into the sea. The rest charge in from the starboard side and head for Chicago with a payload of aerial torpedoes. Chicago cuts loose with an eruption of fire from her 5-inch guns and machine guns. But her own bright tracers and the fireballs of exploding aircraft only expose the cruiser to the enemy.
You're basically saying to the enemy, hey, I'm this guy with the big guns.
She is now the perfect target. 2 torpedoes nail her starboard side. Chicago grinds to a halt. She instantly takes on water and starts to list at the stern. Her situation is desperate. As the wave of Bettys tears off into the silver clouds, sailors aboard Chicago know that their battle is only just beginning.
During the pitch blackness then, the cruiser Louisville comes up and is able to put a towing line across, which is a tricky thing to do in the middle of the night with no illumination. And they begin to drag Chicago out of the battle area.
A 2.5-inch steel towing wire is wrapped around a massive 8-inch turret on the cruiser Louisville and attached to the bow of the Chicago. Slowly, Louisville tows her sister frigate at a steady 5 knots away from the battle area. 350 miles away, USS Enterprise is ordered to take to the seas and support the rescue effort. Target: enemy aircraft attacking USS Chicago. Objective: save the wounded heavy cruiser. Strategy: send planes to fly protection over USS Chicago until she can be towed from the battlefield. Throughout the night, Enterprise plows ahead, while her pilots and air crews prepare for the dangerous operation. January 30th, 1943. As the sun rises over the Solomon Sea, Warplanes roll down Enterprise's wooden deck and take off in search of the crippled USS Chicago. Just after 7 a.m., Enterprise SBDs locate Chicago and her task force.
Well, she just couldn't get underway, so she was being towed by another ship at about 4 knots, just barely getting underway.
So they can't go very fast, they can't maneuver, so yeah, they're definitely sitting ducks. They just got to rely on the support around them to survive that.
It's a haunting replay of attempts to save USS Hornet at Santa Cruz. Enterprise's sister ship Hornet was crippled by torpedoes in the October battle. Before she could be towed to safety, she was finished off by another round of warheads. If the Japanese return, Chicago will provide an inviting target.
For a surface ship, they have basically 2 non-offensive weapons at their disposal. 1 is speed, 2 is maneuverability. When you go in, attach a tow line to a disabled ship, and try to pull her to safety, you've just given up speed and you've given up maneuverability. So you've made yourself pretty predictable.
Enterprise's warplanes carefully patrol the air over the damaged cruiser, on the lookout for enemy intruders. At the same time, the fleet tug Navajo comes alongside Chicago and takes over the task of pulling the heavy ship. Tugs like Navajo are unsung heroes. Named after the native people of the desert Southwest, Navajo is 1,200 tons of workhorse. Armed only with a single 3-inch gun and 2 50-caliber machine guns, the little 200-foot ship sticks her neck out for cruiser Chicago. Tense hours pass as Enterprise pilots watch the rescue operation unfold. For the moment, the skies are clear. Not a single enemy plane or ship in sight. 4 p.m. Enterprise receives warnings from Guadalcanal. 11 unidentified aircraft. Distance, 130 miles. Everyone goes to general quarters, mans his gun or repair station. Ammo is broken out of lockers. Gunners' mates put on helmets and life jackets. Below decks, watertight doors are shut. Plane handlers take their positions in the hangar or flight deck. The ship is cleared for action. Every sailor and marine awaits the enemy strike.
The Japanese, however, are aware that they have done some damage to the American force and they come gunning for the Chicago.
Enterprise immediately launches more Wildcats to meet the Japanese threat. 60 miles out, the twin-engine bombers race towards the American task force. Now, Enterprise's crew relies on their first line of defense, the fighter squadron nicknamed the Grim Reapers. One of them is Don Flash Gordon, a gritty veteran of Santa Cruz.
I tally-hoed 11 Bettys, twin-engine torpedo planes. They were at 1 o'clock again, and they're really fast. They were going to cut behind us, so we made a hard turn to the port. We ended up a little bit behind them.
With Gordon in the lead, the Grim Reapers maneuver into position, ready to defend the fleet, or die trying.
We stayed on their right side and tried to get ahead of them in case they wanted to go to the Enterprise instead of Chicago.
Gordon and the Reaper Wildcats close the distance between the enemy planes as the Japanese flyers race toward the Chicago.
There was a formation of 6 in an echelon, the lead echelon, and 5 in the second.
As the Bettys storm over the task group, the Wildcats bear down with withering 50-caliber firepower.
I burned that lead airplane and it fell out of formation, and the second one was burning and it was falling out.
Gordon and the pilots of Fighting Squadron 10 hammer the enemy airstrike.
Our planes did a very, very good job and practically wiped out that enemy fleet of planes.
But somehow, 4 Bettys survived the Grim Reapers and released their warheads on USS Chicago. At the last possible moment, Navajo tries to turn Chicago to face the enemy and make her a smaller target. But just as Navajo pulls the cruiser head-on with the enemy, the fearsome torpedoes pound into Chicago's hull and detonate in a horrendous blast. Big E's pilots are quick to defend their comrades. Gordon and his fellow aces sweep in and pour hot lead into the enemy strike force. 9 enemy planes are blasted into the afterlife. Only 2 will survive their encounter with Enterprise.
One went east and one went southeast. And the nearest one was going east, and I down on the water, and so I got on the water and raised my nose to fire at him. I'm sure I had full throttle on, but I wasn't catching him.
But the damage is done. Back on USS Chicago. Her survivors abandon ship and can only stand by and watch the bitter end. Below decks, seawater pours through the torpedo holes, rushes over bulkheads, and fills compartments, one after another. From her lower holds and engine rooms to the storage areas, magazines, and passageways, Chicago is soon completely flooded. As she takes on more weight, she slowly starts to roll to her starboard side. Topside, Chicago has one final honor. As flames from the torpedo blast rage on, the heat reaches the powder supply for the 5-inch guns. On her own, with her battle colors still waving in the breeze, Chicago fires off one ghostly salute to her sailors. Then, her heavy superstructure pulls her right over on her side, and Chicago quickly slips beneath the waves. The whole sinking takes only 19 minutes. For 62 American sailors, this ship is their final resting place.
Chicago is then the last large American warship that's lost during the Guadalcanal fight.
It was one of our favorite heavy cruisers.
The loss of the heavy cruiser she was sent to protect is a terrible blow to the Big E. Enterprise simply isn't used to failure. But, though the Chicago is lost, the troop transports she had sailed to defend still deliver their Marines ashore at Guadalcanal. In 6 months of combat, the U.S. has suffered over 7,000 casualties, 29 ships lost, and 600 aircraft shot down. But the Japanese have lost nearly 30,000 men, 38 ships, and as many as 800 aircraft. A U.S. victory at Guadalcanal is undeniable. Now, the U.S. has a major toehold in the South Pacific and an important airbase to launch strategic missions against the enemy. The life and death ordeal at Guadalcanal is finally over. Mission accomplished. By 1943, not a single surviving American warship has seen as much combat in the Pacific as USS Enterprise, from Pearl Harbor to Midway, from the Marshall Islands to the Solomon Sea. Nearly a dozen battles and thousands of sea miles. A score of Imperial ships sent to a watery grave.
We were on the best ship in the Navy. It was going to take care of whatever needed to be taken care of. There was no question but what we were going to pull out of there with a victory.
Enterprise has already seen almost every major naval battle of the war and has beaten the odds. Now she can finally rest. Her crew will get much-deserved R&R at Espiritu Santos. As Enterprise makes her way into the island base, a batch of young officers fresh from midshipman school arrive for assignment. One of them is Oregon native and gunnery officer Ken Peck. Peck and a handful of other officers have just completed a long journey across the Pacific for a rendezvous with Enterprise.
It was the first aircraft carrier, I guess, that I ever saw. And boy, we were excited. We could see it from a distance. And it was a beautiful, big old gray ghost.
For Peck and hundreds of other sailors, his first glimpse of Enterprise is love at first sight.
It's so big, it looks so strong, and the goose pimple just run up and down my back, and they welcomed us aboard and signed us in and told us where we were going to sleep that night. And that's how I came to the Enterprise.
To carriers like USS Enterprise, Espiritu Santos offers a safe harbor, where ships can be refueled and supplied with ammo and reinforcements.
These fleet operating bases gave us a base far enough from action to where they could not be directly threatened by Japanese airplanes, by Japanese ships, They gave us a place where we could send ships back to refit and resupply. It gave us an area where we could bring in new troops that could then ultimately be deployed into combat. It gave us the lifeline that we needed to the rear echelon areas.
For a veteran campaigner, Espiritu offers cold beer, outdoor movies, and needed relief from the rigors of war.
When the ship would tie up in Espiritu Santos, we'd go ashore to work on the planes. We'd work on half a day and then we'd knock off and go swimming.
For myself, sometimes R&R was a shower and a hot meal. It frees up your mind, clears your head, and it kind of prepares you to go back and continue on the fight. And when you go to shore and you finally get to relax, you get to data dump things, which means that you get to block it out, forget about it, and carry on, and that helps you enormously.
For Enterprise veteran Roy Blood from Maine and his buddy Charlie Mason, R&R and Espiritu also offers a bit of adventure. One night, Blood and Mason bum a ride in a Jeep with two pistol-packing Marines.
And the Marines are driving along with the headlights, of course, on this dirt road, speeding along. And all of a sudden, they drag to a stop, and wham, wham, they fire their 45s at something. And I thought, God, the Japs are here.
Suddenly, the enemy reveals itself.
These huge, giant land crabs were coming across the road, migrating, and the Marines were objecting, knocking them off left and right.
All too soon, R&R and Espiritu is over. The Big E gets her orders to move out. The extensive battle damage from 1942 call for major repairs. She will make her way to headquarters at Pearl Harbor. Then the Big E will steam for the States, where she's scheduled to undergo a massive overhaul. In May, Enterprise arrives at Pearl for the first time in more than 6 months, and she receives a very important visitor. Admiral Chester Nimitz steps aboard Enterprise. He stands on hollowed ground, a ship that has come to represent the war itself. A floating battlefield. The wooden deck has been the scene of countless acts of heroism and horror. Nimitz is met by nearly 2,000 sailors, airmen, and Marines who stand at rigid attention. As the crew looks on, he presents Captain Samuel Ginder with the Presidential Unit Citation.
The highest honor that could be given to a ship in the American Navy is the Presidential Unit Citation.
Enterprise is the first American ship ever to receive this award. Not even famous 19th century sailing frigate USS Constitution can claim such an honor.
It's such a big deal because, of course, it is something that is proposed and sponsored by the President of the United States. When the President himself determines that a particular unit or a particular ship is worthy of commendation for a particular action, it is the head man taking time to acknowledge the good work of a particular group of men. It is probably the greatest morale-building moment that the men on the ship see in the early part of the war.
When we were awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, Admiral Bull Halsey sent a message to the Enterprise there, something to the effect, "My heart is always with you." And I think that did as much for us as the award of that citation, because we all thought so much of Bull Halsey and his leadership.
With her battle honors posted on the hangar deck for her entire crew to see, Enterprise finally heads for the good old USA. Bremerton, Washington, summer 1943. The Big E slips into Puget Sound. It's the first time the mighty carrier has been stateside in years. Now, the decorated ship is in for a massive overhaul to make her even tougher and more deadly.
In summer of 1943, the Enterprise went through a repair overhaul. Now, she had been through significant combat and suffered a lot of damage. They looked at this and drew lessons learned from it.
Hundreds of yard workers swarm in to trick out the mighty flat top and get her ripped and ready for more combat. Her additions, a protective torpedo blister, more guns, new radar, and a new plane that will literally change the face of war. The Navy realizes that the greatest threat to carriers like Enterprise are enemy air attacks and Japanese torpedoes.
They proceed to install a torpedo blister along 3/4 of her length that will give her better protection against any torpedo hits that she suffers.
Japanese torpedoes killed her sisters Yorktown and Hornet. The Navy is bound to ensure that Enterprise does not suffer the same fate. The torpedo blister is a steel belt that wraps around the outer edge of the Big E's hull. Between the huge bulge and the ship itself is a part flooded, part air-filled compartment that will absorb the shock of explosion and the sharp fragments of a Japanese warhead. 18 more feet of solid steel and timber are added to her overall length, and her damage control equipment and radar is replaced. But the most important improvement, new 5-inch guns and 36 additional 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns.
The guns are the main thing. We had more quad 40s, and I can't remember now how many there were. Those are big cannons. And they were, when they go off, they make a lot of racket. We had better armament.
Brand new fire control systems link her 5-inch and 40mm batteries. Defending the carrier isn't easy. Enterprise's firepower must pepper the skies with a barrage of flak to hit Imperial planes. But in order to kill the enemy, accurate shooting is a must. Radar-controlled directors can pinpoint the distance and elevation of incoming aircraft and help ensure a kill. Mark 37 and Mark 51 gun directors are mounted on either side of the Big E's island. These systems will provide vital target data and will guide the fire of Enterprise's heavy weapons. The directors calculate firing orders for the gunners' mates, giving the crews the accurate elevation, range, and velocity of an enemy target. And the radar can detect incoming Japanese aircraft at 45,000 yards and enemy vessels at 40,000 yards. The Big E will now be able to shred any incoming enemy planes that invade her airspace, day or night. Nothing in the Japanese anti-aircraft arsenal can compare to the firepower of the radar-guided 40mm guns and 5-inch rifles.
By the end of World War II, no one else's anti-aircraft defenses come anywhere close to the Americans. American warships are incredibly dangerous to approach by the end of 1943, and that situation only gets grimmer for any Japanese attacker as 1944 and 45 goes on.
While the Big E undergoes repairs, the U.S. fleet is rebuilding its forces and getting ready for round 2. But while Enterprise has been out of the action, American forces are still on the move. On the ground, the fighting continues. Across the Pacific and the world, the Allies are closing in on the enemy. But even as the industrial might of America catches up, the Axis shows no signs of surrender. And for Enterprise, the war is anything but over. As the ship readies for combat, many of the Big E's veteran pilots and gunners won't be making the trip back to the war zone. Yet the vacancies left open by casualties and reassignment mean that some of the Big E's veteran sailors get a new opportunity to earn their stripes and fight in the skies. Serving alongside his shipmates since the dark days after Pearl Harbor, Alvin Kernan of Wyoming has finally achieved his dream of flying from the deck of Enterprise.
It's what I always had wanted to do. Besides, there was something known as flight skins or flight pay, which was 50% of your regular pay added on to your regular pay. But it was the status that went with flying.
By November, Enterprise is a new and improved killing machine, ready to take the war to her Imperial enemies. As she prepares for battle, Enterprise gets a new skipper to lead the ship back into the fight, Captain Matthias Gardner. Gardner is a no-nonsense commander, a stern, by-the-book authoritarian. In the words of one sailor, tough as nails. And he's hell-bent on unleashing the fury of the Big E on the islands of the Pacific.
When we got a new skipper, he said, I have no medals and I have no rivets, but I'm taking you out there to get him. And so he felt it was in good condition to go fight again.
Enterprise has her orders, and it's time to get back to the fighting. The Grey Ghost is once again taking to the seas to haunt her old nemesis, the Japanese Empire. When Enterprise steams into Pearl Harbor, the sight of the Big E is an inspiration to every man in port. Now, she joins one of the largest naval fleets ever assembled in history.
The fall of 1943, the U.S. Navy is now in a position to begin initiating this long-anticipated drive through the Central Pacific that everyone has known is coming.
Only a year before, Enterprise was the only carrier left to fight in the Pacific. Now, she's teamed with an armada. The flagship of her task group, Enterprise sails with light carriers Monterey and USS Belleau Wood, battleships Massachusetts and Indiana, cruiser Baltimore, and 6 destroyer escorts. She's also got her old friend, battleship North Carolina, veteran of the Eastern Solomons. Together, this force can deliver the fury of thousands of explosive shells and a venomous strike of more than 200 warplanes.
There was a feeling that we had a lot of power and we're going to use it.
Enterprise and the Pacific Fleet is about to set off on one of the longest naval campaigns in world history. It will mark the start of 560 days of war before she can go home. 560 days of pure hell. The Japanese Navy is not prepared for the return of the Grey Ghost. Their fleet is still licking its wounds, attempting to rebuild. Compared to the U.S. Navy's arsenal of new ships, the Imperial fleet is now down to 12 carriers, 9 battleships, and a mere handful of light and heavy cruisers and destroyers. For now, they're on the sidelines. But Admiral Chester Nimitz will not let up. Instead, he'll pound the enemy garrisons with Enterprise bombs and American infantry. Target, the Gilbert Islands. Objective, seize Macon Atoll, the first of a series of enemy strongholds that must be annihilated. Strategy, bombard the island from the sea and air, then invade it with U.S. Army soldiers.
The Gilbert Islands become important. They're an important stepping stone in the Central Pacific campaign, Chester Nimitz's campaign, which would ultimately end up with real estate in the Marianas. But to get to the Marianas, you had to step over 3 main island groups. First the Gilberts, then the Marshalls, then the Carolines, before you could get to Guam, Saipan, Tinian, and Rota.
November 19th, 1943. Enterprise and her task group are within striking distance of her main target in the Gilberts, Macon Atoll. The invasion will be a 2-pronged assault. While Marines make an amphibious landing at Tarawa, Enterprise will support the simultaneous invasion of Macon by soldiers from the Army's 27th Division. The two forces will attempt to capture both atolls at the same time. Macon Atoll's main island is Butari Tari, an important seaplane and airbase that is manned by nearly 800 Japanese sailors, Marines, and Korean laborers. Butari Tari's land defenses include 2 tank barriers, one on the east near a village, and one to the west near Anchong's wharf. Each barrier is made of logs, barbed wire, concrete pillboxes, and anti-tank guns connected by a series of rifle pits. To the south, along the ocean shore, are 3 80mm coastal guns, 10 machine gun nests, and 85 rifle pits. Along the lagoon to the north, Butari Tari is defended by 80mm coastal guns, flak guns, and machine guns. For 6 solid days, American shellfire has hammered away at these defenses, softening them up for an invasion. But now, it's the Big E's turn to deliver a heavy dose of shock and awe. Dawn. Enterprise turns into the wind as the first strike groups prepare to launch. 33 bombers and fighters roll off Enterprise's deck, climb into the morning sky, and head for Macon. Their mission, destroy the enemy guns and pillboxes. 75 miles from Enterprise, the Japanese garrison at Macon is just beginning to stir. As the sun rises over the atoll, they have no idea of the new force that's about to hit them. As tired troops prepare for another day of bombardment, an awesome new weapon bursts through the sky over the Japanese garrison. It's the new F-6F Hellcat fighter. Since Pearl Harbor, American pilots have struggled against the infamous speed of the Japanese Zero. The enemy fighter plane has ruled the skies of the Pacific for nearly 2 years, outrunning and outgunning the Wildcat. Not anymore. Now, the U.S. introduces a weapon that will change the face of warfare for the entire fleet.
The arrival of the F-6F Hellcat is a real watershed in terms of the American capabilities to both bring offensive firepower to the Japanese and also to defend the fleet effectively.
During the refit, Enterprise took on a squadron of the new fighter planes. 33 feet long, with a maximum speed of 376 miles per hour to the Wildcat's 320 miles per hour. The F-6F is faster and 5 feet longer than the Wildcat. She's also got more firepower. With a standard armament of 6 50-caliber machine guns, she can deliver 2,400 rounds of fearsome ordnance on the enemy and can launch bombs or unguided rockets. U.S. Navy finally has a fighter plane that is more than a match for the legendary Zero.
It's a deadly aircraft when you consider the complement of 50-caliber machine guns on it. It's also rugged and reliable. It's going to change the course of the Pacific War.
In command of the new squadron is Butch O'Hare, one of the best fighter jocks in the U.S. Navy. With 3 years of flying and a score of enemy planes under his belt, Missouri native Edward O'Hare has already earned a Medal of Honor by destroying 5 twin-engine bombers in a single day, becoming the first naval ace in World War II.
Everybody had just the deepest respect for Butch O'Hare because he was fearless. He was a natural-born leader. He was a hero. There's no other way around it.
Now, at Macon Atoll, the Japanese are about to meet Butch O'Hare and the brand new Hellcat fighters of the Big E. Enterprise Hellcats drop out of the sky, blasting the pillboxes and lagoons with lethal 50-caliber machine gun fire. Enemy troops are ripped into pieces, shredded by American firepower before they know what hits them. 9,000 feet above Butari Tari, the SBDs begin their steep 70-degree dives and drop their payloads of 1,000-pound bombs. Explosions shake the island as fuel and ammo dumps are blown to pieces. Hot shrapnel rains down on the living and the dead. A single Dave float biplane takes off out of the lagoon, just as Enterprise torpedo planes arrive over Butari Tari. Moments later, it is shattered by the fire of Enterprise's fighters. The Enterprise TBF Avengers begin dropping 2,000-pound bombs. The heavy ordnance hammers Japanese gun emplacements, bunkers, rifle pits, and tosses human bodies into the air. The 1-2 punch of Hellcat fire and Enterprise bombs has reaped nightmarish results. Day 1 of the battle for Macon is a gruesome success. As one savage day of fighting ends, the U.S. fleet prepares for the next deadly phase of battle. November 20th, 1943. As assault troops from the 27th Division climb over the sides of transports into landing craft, Enterprise air groups storm off on another set of ferocious attacks on Macon. 5:30 a.m., the first strike group launches from the deck of Enterprise. 70 miles away, Japanese forces on Macon await the coming onslaught. Suddenly, the dark shapes of cruisers, destroyers, and transports appear through the morning haze. There are dozens of them. Enterprise SBDs and torpedo planes begin their descent on the island. ready to parole the enemy defenders to hell. Enterprise warplanes unleash a ferocious series of attacks on the Japanese positions, while the cruisers and destroyers move in for the kill. Now, with more Enterprise bombers screaming through the skies and U.S. warships taking aim, the enemy garrison at Macon is about to get an even closer look at American firepower. November 20th, 1943, Macon Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. The atoll is the first step on Admiral Chester Nimitz's drive through the Central Pacific. Bombers, torpedo planes, and brand new Hellcat fighters roar from the deck of the Grey Ghost to wreak havoc on the enemy base. The long flight deck is a perfect runway, but Enterprise has another method for launching aircraft. 2 hydraulic catapults on the port and starboard sides of the flight deck can launch aircraft in the event of an emergency. Once a plane is attached to the catapult, hydraulic fluid is released into a cylinder, causing a ram to blast through, activating pulleys that throw the warplane forward into the wind. And at Macon, Enterprise is launching everything she has. 75 miles away, as Enterprise planes storm the skies, cruiser USS Baltimore and the American gunships take aim at Macon Atoll. Baltimore and the destroyer escorts open up and pepper the island with explosive naval gunfire. The enemy positions shake from the deadly impact of American shells. Baltimore is the lead ship of her class. Born in the steelworks of Massachusetts in 1942, she's 673 feet of Yankee iron. She is armed with 9 8-inch guns, 5-inch .38s, and an arsenal of automatic weapons. Now, she's breaking them in at Macon Atoll. Baltimore's Mark 12 8-inch turrets are a complex system of hoists that bring the heavy ordnance from the magazine and handling rooms to the breech of the guns. The Mark 12 8-inch 55 caliber gun can launch a shell more than 30,000 yards. Baltimore is within deadly killing range of Macon, and Butari Tari is a target-rich environment. She will fire more than 1,300 rounds at the enemy island on this single day. By 8:30 a.m., U.S. soldiers are hitting the beaches as bombs and shells continue to nail the enemy bunkers and pillboxes further inland. High above the fury on the beaches, a single TBF Avenger from Enterprise keeps a close watch on the unfolding action. The mission of the torpedo plane is to report the bombing activity back to Rear Admiral Kelly Turner, who is running the overall bombardment on board USS Pennsylvania. It's the eyes in the sky for the whole operation. Flying as the gunner in the TBF, Alvin Kernan can clearly see the American troops wading ashore.
So we flew very close over the beach, and you could see, it was a grandstand seat, really fine. But the landing craft came in, and we thought there would be a big battle, and they touched the beach, and they let their ramps down on the beach, no problem at all.
Enterprise Hellcats and bombers sweep in and strafe Japanese machine gun nests with merciless firepower. As ground forces begin the savage process of clearing enemy positions with rifles, machine guns, and artillery on the beaches.
And we bombed it, and the fighter planes strafed it, and the battleships shot the hell out of it, and there were palm trees down all over the place.
For the next 4 days, Enterprise pilots and Army riflemen share a working partnership. The Big E's air groups never let up, and each day brings another meal of blood and body parts. As the assault on the maze of pillboxes, bunkers continues. But the Enterprise airstrikes have done their job. The Japanese are unable to mount a strong defense.
For those Japanese soldiers to be getting pummeled like they were getting pummeled on that day, I'm sure that they were thinking, you know what, we kind of messed up when we did this Pearl Harbor thing, you know, and I wish we could turn back the clock. I guarantee you that's what the hell they were thinking.
Success in the invasion of Macon is a certainty. For the crew aboard Enterprise, this battle seems easy compared to the horrors of Guadalcanal. But all of that is about to change. While Enterprise steams just off the war-ravaged beaches of Macon, hundreds of raw recruits are still getting used to life aboard the Big E. Until now, most of the crewmen aboard Enterprise have been volunteers from before the war. By 1943, a new wave of volunteers and draftees fill the ranks of the Navy. A new breed of citizen sailors and Marines.
What you now have in 1943 are a large number of citizen soldiers, Americans that volunteered or were drafted. And they are the ones that are going to carry the fight to the Japanese in the Central Pacific Campaign and then the final assault against the home islands.
That summer, as Enterprise prepared to re-enter the war zone, nearly 40% of her crew had been replaced by recruits straight out of sea school. One of them is Marine Jack Maroney of Dallas, Texas.
I sure wanted to go on the Enterprise. It had a great aura about it, and of course it had an illustrious history. You want to be a part of it.
But not everyone is happy with their new assignments. Marine Lieutenant Richard Hart comes to Enterprise from rural West Virginia. His first impression of the Big E isn't a good one.
First time I saw the Enterprise, she was in dry dock in Bremerton in Puget Sound. And she was draped in every kind of a hose or pipe or conduit or line you've ever seen in your life. There were welders all over her, and it didn't even look like a boat. It looked like some giant, crazy project that somebody started and never finished.
Like many Marines, Hart would prefer to be in the lead of riflemen rather than on the deck of an aircraft carrier.
I didn't go into the Marine Corps to be on a boat. I trained to have a rifle platoon in the Marine Corps, which is what I wanted.
A Marine would rather definitely be fighting with the infantry instead of being on ship, because when you're on ship, it's kind of like you're in prison. You really can't go hunt other human beings. You really can't do what you're trained to do as far as in being an infantryman.
But with the ship at sea and back in the war zone, Lieutenant Hart has a new appreciation for the vessel that has become his home.
I didn't think anything could be so big. I didn't think anything could ever touch her. I just thought she must be absolutely invincible.
Now, in the Gilbert Islands, Richard Hart is about to find out that when the Japanese attack, there's no such thing as an invincible ship. November 25th, 1943, 7 p.m. It's Thanksgiving Day, 5 days after launching the assault on Macon. But in the waters off of Macon Atoll, there's no time for prayer. Flares explode in the skies over USS Enterprise and her task group. Moments later, Japanese twin-engine bombers streak overhead, delivering a grim message with Imperial warheads. Battleship North Carolina and the destroyer escorts open fire and beat down the enemy. But Enterprise holds her fire. Nearly 2 years of combat in the Pacific War have taught the crew that tracers fired from her anti-aircraft guns only mark the ship as a target in the shadows of night. Instead, she leaves the job to the gunships around her. The air above the task force explodes with shells from the escorts. For Lieutenant Hart and his untested Marines, this is the first brush with the enemy. The Leathernecks man their battle stations and await the order to fire.
I'd never seen a war before, and I wanted to get a good look at it, so I climbed up on an ammunition box so I could see better. And there was a much wiser sergeant sitting beside me, or standing beside me, and he said, "Lieutenant, I think you better get down. That's not a good place to stand." So, fortunately, I jumped down, and I think a split second after my feet hit the deck, there was a whang.
A piece of shrapnel the size of Hart's hand slams into the splinter shield right where he'd been standing only seconds before. It could have cut the Marine in two.
So that taught me that there's no sense sticking my head up when I didn't have to.
Gunners aboard Enterprise hold their fire as the battle rages on. If they open up with their guns, they might suffer the same fate as USS Chicago.
We stood there by our guns, helpless and not doing anything, but we were well protected by battleships and cruisers, and of course the destroyers on the periphery of the task force. And then of course the Japs would have aerial flares that light up like your stadium and a football game.
The fire from 40mm and 5-inch shells would make Enterprise a prime target.
And when you've got many guns going, it is like a Christmas tree. Everything is lighted up and it marks your position. If you don't have any lights showing, but a gun shoots for 20 seconds or something like that, an enemy, he'd have a position on you.
Battleship North Carolina hammers out a lethal explosion of lead and blasts a Betty out of the sky. Within minutes, the assault is over. The Japanese have failed to sink a single American ship. Enterprise is safe. She survives to see another sunset in the tropics. The next morning, American commanders decide that something must be done to protect Enterprise when darkness falls. For years, the Japanese Navy and Army have utilized extensive night training and tactics, and they know that the U.S. fleet has not practiced this type of warfare. Almost 2 years into World War II, nightfall is still one of the greatest threats. If the U.S. Navy is going to save its carriers at night, it's going to have to adapt to the type of night attack strategy that the Japanese use against them.
We had on board at the time an air group commander named Bill Martin, and he'd been interested in night flying. And he couldn't get it off his mind. And he finally prevailed on the powers that be to do a little bit of experimenting.
For the first time in the Pacific War, a night air operation will be launched from an American carrier. And Medal of Honor ace Butch O'Hare answers the call to lead a group of volunteers on this experimental mission.
Somebody like Butch O'Hare that volunteers to launch off a carrier, first of all, at night for the very first time, what does that say about him? That just shows you that he is a true professional. And I guarantee it, he's the kind of guy that volunteered to do it so his buddies wouldn't have to.
O'Hare's volunteers are nicknamed the Black Panthers. Their objective, defend Enterprise and her task force from the fierce nighttime attacks that have claimed dozens of ships. Strategy, 3 Hellcat fighters and 1 radar-guided Avenger torpedo plane will attempt to intercept any incoming Japanese night assault. The radar in the Avenger will make the entire operation possible. It will literally be the eyes in the sky. Without it, O'Hare and his fellow fighter pilots would be flying blind. Designed by MIT engineers, the heavy radar set in the TBF will locate the enemy planes and guide O'Hare's fighters into shooting position. Flying in the radar-equipped Avenger is Alvin Kernan.
And we were supposed to go up, and between the radar on board the ship and the radar in the torpedo plane, we were supposed to find these intruders, Japanese raiders, and lead the fighter planes to them. I wasn't afraid, I remember that. I always felt that your fear came while you were on the deck. And then when you got in the plane and pulled up the armor plate and locked yourself in, there wasn't any way of getting out. So the fear seemed to go away.
As the coming night approaches, the Enterprise airmen prepare for their mission impossible.
I watched Butch as he went to his plane that evening of the 26th, and he looked like he had the world on his shoulders.
At 6 p.m., the 3 planes take off in search of enemy aircraft. 7 p.m. Sure enough, the Black Panthers run right into a force of incoming twin-engine Bettys, headed for Enterprise and the American task force. Kernan and his comrades can clearly make out nearly 20 Japanese bombers, flying in different formations, all of them headed for Enterprise and the task force. The TBF closes within 200 yards of a Betty and opens fire.
It wasn't until they started firing right back at me that I began to get a little frightened.
The 2 warplanes hammer away at each other. Hot lead from the Avenger's 50s burn the enemy bomber. 3 miles away, O'Hare and his wingman can see the tracers of the Avenger and watch as the flaming enemy plane pitches towards the ocean. The fighters race to catch up with the TBF. Just then, the Avenger nails yet another Japanese Betty. Somehow, a Betty maneuvers just behind and above O'Hare's fighter plane. The enemy plane tears into O'Hare's Hellcat with 7.7 millimeter bullets. The famous aviator is caught in a deadly stream of lead. Suddenly, O'Hare's plane rolls away and disappears into the darkness. He's never seen again. The Japanese night attack is halted, but the loss of O'Hare devastates the crew of Enterprise. One of Enterprise's and America's finest warriors is gone. Neither his aircraft nor his remains are ever recovered.
It really hurt us when he went down. I think it was the sadness was felt throughout the whole ship that we really lost a hero when Butch was lost.
America's first night combat mission has cost one of its top aces. And the future of this new strategy is uncertain. But despite the tragic fate of Butch O'Hare, Enterprise has successfully launched the first night air interception. Once again, the Big E has just made history. Guided onto the Big E's flight deck, the surviving Black Panthers amazingly make it aboard at 9 p.m.
It's a big moment because previously, fighter aircraft flying combat air patrol for the aircraft carrier were operating almost exclusively during the day. But now, as of November 26, 1943, they can do it at night.
As November draws to a close, the Gilbert Islands are now firmly in the hands of U.S. forces. Unlike the months-long campaign for Guadalcanal, the U.S. Navy now has the power to deliver a faster killing blow. What begins at Macon and Tarawa will continue until the enemy is brought to its knees. For the mighty Enterprise, the Gray Ghost, it is only the beginning of a long campaign.